welcome you all to King's College and to the Ramphal Institute. This is the very first event that the Institute is doing for the year, and we're pleased that you could join us. And we're also particularly pleased that there's so many from the High Commissions. I should first of all say to you, for those of you who might not be very familiar with the Ramphal Institute, give you an indication of what we do, what we are, what we stand for, and where hopefully we are going. And maybe at some stage, not today, but in the future, we might be able to talk about greater collaboration with you in various fields in which you operate. First of all, who we are. The Ramphal Institute is a not-for-profit organization which works in the areas of social and economic policy, governance, and environment, and it seeks to advance and share knowledge in those fields to the benefit of policymakers in particular. Now, why do we have that name? Why the Ramphal Institute? Well, we named after Sir Sridhar Ramphal, who many of you, I'm sure, know. And our aim is to continue his pioneering and courageous work to advance sustainable development and global justice. And we believe that just as in his heyday in the 80s, etc., when he stood up for those very same issues, with courage in particular, that same courage is needed to address today's own and different problems of climate change, poverty, alleviation, etc. And we hope to emulate his determination in searching for solutions to the problems. The Institute is, of course, very small, but we operate by trying to leverage our efforts with those of others. We cannot do everything, we cannot do much on our own, but with other like-minded agencies, institutions, etc., we can achieve considerable amounts. As I mentioned, this is the first event for this year, and I would just wish to give an indication, although I could do this now or probably maybe towards the ending of the session, of some of the other areas in which the Ramphal Institute will be having activities and will be initiating work that might be of interest, but possibly so as not to distract in any way from this specific work that we are doing this afternoon. I prefer to leave this to the end of the session. So once again, welcome to the Ramphal Institute, and I will pass you over to our moderator for today, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Fair Trade UK, Mr. Michael Gibney. He also is, and we're very proud to have him, as he is also a trustee of the Ramphal Institute. So I pass you over to Mike.
Thank you, Edwin. Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. We're doing something really interesting at a really good time, I think, and I congratulate the Ramphal Institute and Edwin and the team in convening us here. There has been, I think, in the last few months, real momentum in certain policy fora around creating international agreements. Think of the rhetoric, if not the reality, of the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals back in September in New York, where the world governments came together to agree a really ambitious set of challenges, possibly too ambitious, between now and 2030. You may criticise the detail, but actually the aspiration and the vision is really compelling. And think about the Paris climate change talks. Similarly, I think, the detail is missing in lots of ways, but the aspiration, the vision to create a more sustainable intergovernmental approach to climate change is really compelling. Set against that, we're struggling with global trade. We just don't have the level of ambition, the level of vision that you might see in the global goals discussion or you might see in the climate change discussion. Those of you who followed the World Trade Organization discussions before Christmas, meeting in the ministerial in Nairobi, you'll know that precious little was agreed, precious little new was discussed, and actually some of the results were no more than agreements made many years ago, and even worse than that in some ways. I think this ministerial was the first one that didn't reaffirm any statement of intent around the Doha Development Agenda, which has been the overarching theme of trade policy discussions for the last 14 years and more. So we don't have that level of ambition and momentum. Why not? And I think a key way of getting into this is to look at what's behind some of the approaches and priorities of the EU as a major trading bloc, a major negotiating force, as we know. And then to look particularly at how the EU is seeking to relate to Africa, and more broadly to the ACP, gets us into understanding some of the problems, the trade-offs, the difficulties which are preventing a more ambitious global agenda. So I think it's absolutely timely. I think we're spot on, and well done for organising it for us. I can't think of anybody better to tee up the discussion than Dr Paul Goodison, who's a senior research fellow at the Ramphal Institute. Many of you will know him already. He headed up the European Research Office for, I think, 18 years, Paul? Yeah. Before going freelance, still working very much in the same field, very focused on a forensic analysis of EU trade policy, looking particularly at the way the EU relates to the ACP, looking in specific commodity areas, in particular regions. You had a lot of specialism in Southern Africa, I think, working with SADC as well. So Paul has a long experience in understanding what is motivating the EU. You'll navigate us through what the current EU trade vision is and how it might relate to Africa in particular. It'll be an immensely helpful discussion. So the way we're going to play it is we're going to hear from Paul. I hope it'll be provocative in what you say. We'll be provocative with you. And then we're going to invite a couple of other speakers to come and be discussants. I'll introduce them when they come up to the panel. And then we'll throw it open to question and answers. And I do encourage everybody to dive in and pile in, and let's try and work this thing out together. In order to help you before we kick off, should we just ask everyone in the room just to quickly introduce who you are so we understand where you're coming from? So.
Kofi Addo, Head of Trade and Investment, Ghana High Commission.
Namti Asari, Ghana High Commission.
Peter Dunn, I'm from SARS.
Dennis Suzuka, Minister Council for Councillor for the Affairs.
For
Councillor Political Affairs for the Cameroon High Commission.
Thank you.
David Roberts, I'm a trustee like you at the Ramphal Institute. I was at one time responsible for agricultural negotiations in the EU, and in fact largely wrote the part of the chapter on agriculture. So I don't agree with what you just said.
No, that's fine. That's what you're coming to be discussing.
Sheila Page, Overseas Development Institute.
Jim Keane, Economic Advisor, Commonwealth Secretary.
Received from Christian Aid. I was a store paper campaign, and we used to define the acronym like Stop Europe Poaching Africa.
Hi, my name is Irene from Zambia High Commission, First Secretary Trade.
Hello, I'm Sarah Franklin, and I study at LSE.
Dennis Bernard, Caribbean Enterprise Network. Our focus is to create the African Caribbean Triangle.
Great, well we've got a lot of good different perspectives in the room, so we're going to have a fun conversation. David and Jodie will come up and be discussing after, which should be terrific. First off, let's go straight over to Paul, who's going to talk us through your analysis of where we are, and then we'll come back and discuss. Paul.
Thanks, Michael. I don't think we'll have any problem having a discussion with David and Sheila and Jodie and everybody else. So let's kick off. I'm going to try and focus specifically on the kind of overlap between the implementation of the final stages of capital reform and what it's meaning in terms of plans of European investment and trade into Africa. And the new EPA agreements, which have been initialed and not always signed, but which in the coming 2 to 3 years should begin to enter the implementation phase. In the light of the new policy document, Trade for All, which the European Commission tabled in October, and to try and have a look at what that means for agro-food sector development in different African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, in the light of the kind of policy tools which African governments are seeking to use to develop their agro-food sectors, particularly since the food price crisis. I'm not going to look at EPAs in general and their overall effects and their merits and demerits, and I'm not going to look at all aspects of the Trade for All document. I'm going to look at specifically those areas where they overlap in the light of capital reform implementation. So hopefully we can have a discussion around those issues as we proceed. First remark I'd like to make before we start is I find the European Commission, David may disagree, but I find the European Commission an immensely patient institution in that it always takes the long view. In the work that I've been doing, we've always been looking at 8 to 9 year time frames from initial conception to final execution of any kind of policy approach towards Africa. So it needs to be looked at in that long-term framework, that there's a vision, the Commission moves things forward, it faces setbacks, it tries to move things forward, always on the basis of its own overall agenda. And a surprisingly flexible institution, I find it over time, because if it can't move its agenda forward in one forum, it will switch the emphasis to another forum. So it's a very interesting institution. David, no doubt, will have a lot more to say about it. Let's start with the context, if we can, and just a few bullet points just to get people thinking a little bit about it. If you look at the sub-Saharan African context, the high dependency of these countries on agro-food sector for livelihoods. Oh, by the way, how long have you given me, Mike?
25 minutes.
25 minutes. Okay, give me a 5-minute one. The aspirations of African governments to develop their agro-food sector since the food price crisis, to try and move up the value chain in serving national needs and international markets. And yet in some sectors we see a rising level of import dependency. If you take a sector like the poultry sector, I see Cameroon is here, Ghana is here, Zambia, all of the interest in the poultry sector. We find that since 2004, consumption of poultry meat has almost doubled in Africa. But production hasn't kept pace, and as a consequence, imports have tripled, imports of poultry meat in the last 10 years. And it's not been uniform across all countries. In some countries it's focused. In the case of the EU exports, it's a handful of countries. In other countries, they've been able to pursue policies which have preserved the space for development of their poultry sectors, with, in some countries, quite impressive gains in terms of new income earning opportunities for feed suppliers and employment in the poultry sector itself. But it's not just the poultry sector we're seeing this rising import dependency, so we have to bear that in mind. If we look at the EU context, we find that in the EU, the CAP reform has seen a shift in focus away from the internal EU market to international markets. They've recognised that really demand growth in Europe is relatively stagnant. As we get more affluent in Europe, we don't all eat more, some of us do, unfortunately, particularly after Christmas or over Christmas. We eat differently. And where we're seeing the main demand growth is beyond the EU. And
CAP reform and the EU's agri-food sector trade policy agenda have been designed to help support that transition in the focus of European agri-food sector production away from Europe and towards faster growing markets, particularly for value-added food products and quality differentiated products. There's a recognition that in many areas the EU can't compete on price, so they're sidestepping the challenge by focusing on quality. You have the food safety, SBS standards, all of these issues then coming up for countries wanting to export to Europe. It's a conscious policy, eh? It's not an accident, it's not an incidental byproduct. It's part of a coherent policy to reposition European agri-food sector within the domestic European market and internationally. Now, while the focus on value-added products, quality differentiated products, there's still a very important focus on undifferentiated commodity exports, agricultural commodity exports, to Africa in particular. In certain instances, with African markets playing an important safety net function, you only have to think about what happened following the Russian import embargo to see how European companies were falling over themselves to find new markets for bulk commodities, for example, milk powder exports. Or if you look at the Russian, not before the embargo, we had the obstacles being placed around poultry exports. And we saw the African markets just taking off in terms of importance, totally poultry exports. It doubled, in fact, the importance of sub-Saharan African markets in 5 years, from 20% of total EU poultry meat exports to 40%. Coinciding precisely with when the Russians, which had been the major market, began placing import restrictions. So some of these African markets become much more important as safety net markets. That means they're a focus for an outlet for European products to help sustain production in Europe and sustain markets in Europe. And the impact on local supply chains is really largely irrelevant. Not in all instances. Some companies are acting a bit more responsibly. There's a pan-European dairy company called Arla, which you may be seeing more of in the UK recently. Last year in January, they adopted a policy that said they want to have a responsible trade and investment relations in the dairy sector in Africa. And they made this public statement, and then they went and invested in a series of joint ventures with distribution companies for dairy products, which had no link to local dairy sector development in Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Nigeria, Ethiopia, and now they're looking further south, so watch out. But the principle was there that they should be more responsible, that in the long term, exporting bulk commodities wasn't necessarily what they wanted to do. And since it's a farmer-owned cooperative, they were very sensitive to farmer issues. And they placed an emphasis on responsible trade investment, a thing which has come back in the EU's Trade for All document, by the way, having a responsible EU trade policy. We've had a lot of CAP reform. David knows more about it than I do. He could write reams on it right now. He's much better informed than I am. But the broad points that I'm drawing out of this is that we've had a lot of changes in how the EU supports its agricultural sector, but we still have massive levels of financial assistance, particularly in sensitive agricultural sectors. Again, if we take the dairy sector, where prices in Europe are sensitive to oversupply, very, very sensitive, we have decoupled payments estimated at about 5 billion per annum to EU dairy producers. We have coupled payments, voluntary coupled payments, 829 million euro in those least productive areas of the EU for milk production, covering 50% of the dairy herd. And we have these safety net measures whenever there's a crisis, which help make sure that farmers, how much they suffer is reduced. They still suffer, but they don't actually suffer to such an extent that farmers go out of business and European production shrinks in line with the constriction of global demand for dairy products. What we have is Europe last year providing something like 66% of the growth in global milk production. When New Zealand was pulling back on production and the US was halting or reducing its expansion and expanding domestic use of milk. So it's the EU that's contributing to this major imbalance in the dairy sector on the basis of high levels of public sector support. So it's not exactly a level playing field. What we're having, in fact, is a displacement of adjustment to global demand challenges, to non-EU producers in the milk sector. And when I talk to people in Southern Africa, in Namibia, for example, where they've got a very tiny dairy industry, but they're very proud of it because they've developed it from virtually nothing, and they're saying they've got about 3 months before they go under, given how much liquid milk they're accumulating, which they can't sell. You just happen to have had more than a doubling of EU milk powder exports to South Africa. We can discuss that later, the specifics of that, because it's all linked to patterns of European investment, very closely linked to patterns of European investment. So we have these levels of public sector support. We also have a very strongly managed trade regime in the agricultural sector in Europe. If you look again, if you look at the dairy sector, you see how those import licenses for dairy products where the EU does allow access are grossly underutilised in the last year. Of course, they tightly manage EU agricultural markets. They have IMFN tariffs. They can, when they need to, they can adjust tariffs within their valve ceilings, as they did in the cereal sector 18 months ago when prices were falling. They have about, I think in 2013, the WTO identified 112 tariff rate quotas which they use to manage trade in sensitive products. It's more now as more trade agreements come on stream. And it retains the right to use agricultural safeguard mechanisms quite extensively. In fact, they have the right to use it in nearly 540 tariff lines. They don't use them, but they have the right to, should the need arise. And in some sectors, like poultry, they use it very extensively, poultry. And in fact, it's through the trade regime that the European poultry producers are protected. They don't get a lot of financial support. But what happens is that when their costs increase, they can pass that on to domestic consumers without fearing increased competition for imports, and they can maintain their export price competitiveness. Poultry, of course, the additional problem you've got is poultry parts, which we don't consume in Europe to such a degree, and those are just being dumped at prices which, providing it exceeds the transportation cost, minus the cost of alternative disposal, are just going out to African markets hand over fist. So we have this context in Europe in the agro-food sector where we can't really talk about free trade. And we certainly can't talk about fair trade in any sense of the word. And it's a worrying source of concern, given that we've got this EU trade policy, which is increasingly focused on systematically eliminating non-tariff barriers to EU agro-food exports through these economic partnership agreements. Not only economic partnership agreements, if necessary, they would use the WTO. More generally, in the case of Ghana in particular, they will enter into dialogue with government as to why it's sensible not to use these types of policy tools, and how it could jeopardise the coherence of their agricultural policies and the future of EU aid in the agricultural sector. This kind of stuff. They have different ways of pushing their agenda. But the thing about the EPAs is this focus on non-tariff barriers and non-tariff measures. And it dates back really, if you can really trace it back in terms of public discussion to June 2007, when they had this symposium with EU agro-food exporters, and they said to them, what's the main agenda for these trade negotiations? What should we be focusing on? And they said, eliminate non-tariff barriers. Tariffs, we're not worried about them. We can deal with tariffs. Non-tariff measures are the key thing. And my friends who were dealing with the EPA negotiations in African governments said it was in September when they came back that they suddenly found these provisions being proposed in the EPAs, tackling non-tariff measures much more systematically. Because the Commission at the time made it quite clear these barriers won't go away on their own, and the EU needs a systematic policy to secure their dismantling. Commission's a very, very patient animal. 7 years later, they're approaching the stage where they can begin to pursue the elimination of non-tariff barriers because they now have the agreements in place. I'm going on far too long. My time is marching on. Just a few quick points on the sub-Saharan African side in terms of trade relations with Europe. We're actually seeing a decline in the agro-food trade surplus with most of the major regions where the EU is signing trade agreements with EU and the EU. So I think if we look at West Africa, their trade surplus with the EU declined 95%. Agro-food sector trade surplus declined 95% between 2009 and 2013. In part, this is a product of the success of the EU in reorientating its agro-food sector to international markets. Partly linked to Europe having safe, high-quality food. Because those growing urban markets in West Africa, for example, urban consumers like the idea that they're not feeding bad food to their families. So they will pay price premiums for something that's got that European endorsement of safe, nutritious food. It's the same across all African regions. Value of exports of agro-food products from Europe to Africa, the growth in it is far greater than the increase in the value of exports to Europe. That's also linked to the structure of the trade, one being basically commodity-based, the other one moving more into higher value products. There's also growing EU investment and trade relations in sub-Saharan Africa. I've mentioned already Arla in the dairy sector. Arla is not alone. In the run-up to the abolition of milk production quotas, major European dairy companies like Friesland Campina, Arla and Danone were busy consolidating their footholds in different African regions in order to deal with the growth in milk supplies, particularly for the farmer-owned dairy cooperatives, Friesland Campina and Arla. And they've got a clear strategy. They want to export the milk powder, which they had invested in expanding production of in European preparations for quota abolition, but they want to get into the realization of the value of the final consumer products being sold on the basis of imported milk powders. So they're setting up a multiplicity of joint ventures across Africa within a context where they're expecting in the coming 4 or 5 years to quadruple or quintuple the value of their dairy exports to these African markets, with scant regard, with the exception of Arla, being paid to the impact on the functioning of local milk to dairy supply chains. Now, obviously, the significance of that varies whether you're in West Africa, where you have a very heavy import dependency in the dairy sector, or in East Africa, where you have a thriving smallholder dairy farming community, or in Southern Africa, where you have a fairly mixed bunch with a lot of European corporate penetration, but also smaller dairies emerging. In terms of investment focus, you look at the sugar sector, and you see that the Europeans are actually repositioning themselves. Sugar companies, which in 2005 were exclusively European focused, now have, what, 2/3 of their production outside of Europe. Associated British Foods, for example, has a foothold in China, a strong foothold in China, and a strong foothold in Southern Africa. And they're orientating towards where that growth in sugar demand is going to be across the globe, in the Asian markets, and they're positioning themselves for that. And this has implications for the scope of African government to promote movement of those sugar supply chains. Because you'll find that where ABF is solidly entrenched, they're not really interested in moving into refined sugar products, because they own the refineries in Spain, in Britain, and they had some very efficient co-refineries, beet refiners that are now refining raw cane sugar very, very profitably. And they are positioning themselves to the end of European sugar production quotas to serve deficit markets in Europe, either from expanded European production or from imported sugars. So we've got this trade and investment relationship driven by CAP reform, seeking to capitalise on EPA agreements, which is going to change the context of agro-food sector development, not in all food sectors, but in specific sectors where the role of EU policy instruments is quite significant. Quickly, we'll run through the Aid for Trade document. Not the Aid for Trade, what am I saying? The Trade for All. Good God, I put that the wrong way round. I do apologise.
Old habits dying.
The old habits dying hard. And this is why you shouldn't copy from earlier files. It should be Trade for All, not A for T, okay? I do apologise for that stupid infantile error.
Imagine it could go straight into the trade.
So
Imagine it could be structured good for the description of trade. If it's in WTO process and ignored.
1996, we're now in 2016, and this was the game plan 20 years ago. And we're now getting to the implementation, realisation of that game plan. So people who say to you, oh, the EPA debates are passé, it's all over, my God, it's just starting. Because what we're getting to is the implementation of these agreements, which could carry some profound implications. This Trade for All document reiterated the focus on removing non-tariff barriers to EU exports, yet at the same time called for a responsible EU trade policy which brings benefits to developing countries. Bearing in mind the demand for food products in Africa, the Europeans are expecting it to mushroom, and they are wanting in on the act. Viewed from the other side of the telescope, of course, that growth in domestic demand in sub-Saharan Africa could provide the impetus for the rejuvenation of local African agro-food sectors. How do we make sure, within a responsible EU trade policy, that that issue is actually articulated and we begin to move towards addressing how that growing African demand can be used to actually re-stimulate African agro-food sector development? The EU has acknowledged, by the way, that the conclusion of the economic partnership agreements are simply the starting point for the pursuit of their policy agenda. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. Let's move on, because we're going to be running out of time soon, and I do rather go on. You can read these quotes, the trade for all, what the EU says on the link between that and development. You're familiar with it. Trade and investment policy must be consistent with the instruments of EU external action. It also says, by the way, they should be consistent with EU policy priorities, domestic policy priorities. Economic growth must go hand in hand with social justice, respect for human rights, high labour, environmental standards, health and safety protection. Which can mean, by the way, that health and say how we implement SPS controls and food safety controls is not up for negotiation. This is a sidebar issue. Often it's not the nature of these standards which is a problem for sub-Saharan African exporters, although in many cases it is. In the better and more advanced countries, it's how they're being applied which is posing the problems. Forefront integrating, EU is in the forefront of integrating sustainability objectives into trade policy. They speak about EBA initiative, they speak about rules of origin, they talk about policy coherence for development commitments. What they don't talk about is the impact of EPAs on local agricultural and agro-food sector markets and the scope for African countries to develop their own agro-food sectors in response to growing demand. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's their fastest growing continent of the past decade. They talk about making growth sustainable. Not quite sure what they mean by that when they talk about it, but it's all in vogue. I'm not sure what's so sustainable about quadrupling milk powder exports to West Africa and undermining government policies to develop local milk supply chains, but that's just a side comment. They talk about the need for African governments to establish an effective agenda for economic transformation, industrialisation, and the importance of implementing genuine domestic reforms, as opposed to the ones that you choose for yourself, of course. Fully implement EPAs so they deliver their potential in terms of development. Extend EPAs to service investment issues, continue to support regional integration, including aid for trade. There it is. Bilateral trade agreements. Growing importance, we've already mentioned that. Key challenge for you, making sure great negotiated agreements make a difference. What do they mean by that? Well, they point out that the EU is one of the world's largest agro-food exporters, but they don't always enjoy access that they should have to overseas markets. So what they mean about making sure they make a difference, it means making sure those barriers to EU exports are systematically removed. The agenda that was most clearly articulated in 2007. By the way, all the documents from that conference are still on the EC's website, or they were last time I looked, and it makes very interesting reading in terms of the agenda that they're pursuing. It requires tackling barriers in a comprehensive way, along with effective implementation and enforcement of these agreements, without leaving room for new barriers to replace old ones. And we must ensure that the partners play by the rules. That means the small print of the wording that you've agreed to in your economic partnership agreements is very, very important. You have to look at how much wriggle room you have got and how much room some of your neighbours will have who have signed different economic partnership agreement texts, because they're not all the same. The provisions dealing with the elimination of non-tariff measures vary from agreement to agreement. And in some agreements where they were highly contentious, the wording is highly ambiguous and subject to varied interpretations. I've got 5 minutes. EU Council conclusions. They're looking forward to swiftly signing, ratifying, implementing EPAs, streamlining customs procedures, reducing non-tariff barriers. Utmost importance attached to fighting all forms of protectionism. Challenges of EPAs. This is the key issue, I think. The challenges of EPAs. How can we view this? The EU takes the view, and Commissioner Malmström said this in Nigeria at a business forum meeting. She said, don't worry about the agricultural sector. We've largely excluded it from tariff elimination, so the interests of the farmers have been protected. No discussion whatsoever of how the EU intends to interpret and apply commitments in EPAs on the elimination of non-tariff barriers to trade, which since 2007 have been seen as the main obstacles to EU exports of agri-food products. Now, I've had only a cursory review of the use of these trade policy tools, different trade policy tools, by African governments, and I find they're being extensively used in West Africa, in various ways, shapes and forms, and in Central Africa. And the use of some of these policy tools, could conceivably be brought into question from the date of entry into force of economic partnership agreements. So I would strongly advise governments to look very carefully at what current sub-Saharan African governments, to look carefully at what non-tariff measures you currently use as part of specific sector development strategies, which could be brought into question under the various EPA provisions. Because it's these provisions on non-tariff measures which will see the first impact of these economic partnership agreements on your agro-food sector. Forget the tariff commitments you've made. It's how these provisions will be interpreted and applied. Now, here's the contentious provisions that we're talking about, primarily. I mentioned the standstill commitments because that led to a particular problem in South Africa in terms of trade relations with other trade partners in the poultry sector. Because what they did is they tried to use the water in their bound tariffs by raising the tariff on imported poultry meat, but they found they couldn't do it against the EU. They did it against the USA and Brazil, and of course the USA threatened to withdraw the AGOA preferences from South Africa if they didn't remove the discrimination. So the tariff standstill commitments could have profound implications on your ability to use the water in your bound tariffs, because you won't be allowed to use it in trade with the EU. And if you use it against the US, Brazil and others, and not against the EU, they're going to come back at you and say, hey, what do you think you're doing? This is discriminatory. Prohibitions and quantitative restrictions. Worthwhile looking at what it says in your agreement compared to the other agreements, because they vary. National treatment on internal taxation and regulation. Some of these are used to link the allocation of import licenses to local procurement requirements or local purchase requirements as part of strategies to strengthen the functioning of local supply chain. Case in point, Namibia's horticulture sector, where in the last 10 years they have increased local production of vegetables for the local market from 5% to 52% in 2014 by having these tied import licenses, which incidentally they only ever used once where they withdrew an import license. What they did is they changed the thinking of local traders and supermarkets on how they would position themselves in terms of the sale of local horticultural products. And now you go in a supermarket in Namibia, and those South African-owned supermarkets have got proudly Namibian stalls displaying all their new horticultural products. The mindset was changed. It wasn't done through the central buying office in the foreign, in the corporate headquarters in a neighbouring country. It was done with reference to what they could get away with within the government's new policy. But it changed their mindset eventually. where they saw it as a good market positioning tool and not an imposition from government. Agricultural safeguard provisions, instant industry protection measures, all of these, use of all of these instruments will potentially be restricted by how the EPA agreement provisions are interpreted and applied. And this will impact the types of non-tariff measures they're talking about, if you're not familiar with it. Seasonal import restrictions, tied import licenses, import permits, import quotas, import bans, discriminatory levies and taxes. Some countries, for example, impose VAT on imported food products but not domestically produced ones. Export restrictions. These are the type of measures we're talking about, which could be brought into question by these EPA agreements. Now, in some cases, these non-tariff measures are used in a transparent, accountable manner as part of integrated sector development programs. I've mentioned the Namibian example as a very good example. In other instances, they actually provide scope for local development. So, for example, if we take Mozambique and Senegal, import restrictions on poultry meat introduced at the time of the avian influenza outbreak have been retained for the last 10 years and have seen massive expansions of local poultry meat production. And a growing threat in the case of Mozambique of smuggled meat from neighbouring South Africa, where EU exports of poultry parts increased 25-fold in 5 years. From 7,000 tonnes to, I think, 204,000 tonnes and counting in October last year. And that is spilling over the border into Mozambique, into Zimbabwe, into Zambia. Even because it's displacing some Brazilian meat in the South African market, they're having problems with smuggling of meat into Tanzania, both in Zanzibar and Tanzania mainland. So there's knock-on effects. Point is, the use of these restrictive measures linked to avian influenza outbreaks could be brought into question when the AI threat is seen to have diminished under the EPAs. Focusing on the illicit or inappropriate use of SPS trade restrictions is one of the priorities under the EU's trade policy. Of course, you all know about it. These use of non-tariff measures can be abused and are abused extensively, often to create rent-seeking opportunities for local producers and politically connected traders. So the aim is to actually try and move away from that towards a more transparent, accountable and responsible use of these trade measures as part of integrated sector development programs. Hopefully, they're negotiated and set up within a regional framework so you get consistency with regional trade liberalisation agendas. I won't go on anymore about responsible and new implementation of EPAs because we have these various commitments in the Trade for All document which could provide a window of opportunity of opening the dialogue with the Europeans on how to responsibly apply these trade agreements so as not to close off the space for agro-food sector development in Zambia, in Ghana, in Cameroon, in Namibia, in Mozambique, you name it. You need to start coordinating across yourselves from your embassies in EU member states and your embassies in Brussels about the nature of the challenge which these EPAs could pose to agro-food sectors which are important to you. And then you need a coordinated response which enables you to raise your concerns with all institutions of the European Union. Not just the European Commission, which is your main intermediary in all of these discussions, but also with those EU member states who themselves are investing in agro-food sector development in Africa in areas which could be directly undermined by how the EC, the European Commission, chooses to interpret and apply economic partnership agreements. I'll leave it there because Mike wants me to stop. So.
Well done, thank you.